All right, let's start out by saying Barak Yahweh, Ba'Hashem Yahushai, Ba'Hashem, Rachah Kodash. Welcome to another live lesson. The name of this one is Jake that compelled other Jake to break the law. Now, pretty much this lesson is inspired by a video I was just watching. The elder Mawatazak out there in Cali. You know, he was going into some history on Alexander. You know, he's going into the Maccabees, you know, and history on the four generals of the Greek Empire that followed in rulership after Alexander, and how they were compelled. You know, they pushed Hellenization, and then they had individuals going from town to town, pretty much compelling Israelites to break the law, you know, not to keep the Sabbath, not to circumcise their sons, you know, not to keep the law, so on and so forth. But the thing about it that you have to also understand is that you had sellouts back there, and those sellouts were used as pawns by Antiochus Epiphanes, which came out of the Seleucid line. Antiochus Epiphanes IV. You had the Seleucid line, and in the Seleucid line you had the Seleucid dynasty, which you had some rulers that were called Seleucid and others that were called Antiochus. All right, so Antiochus IV Epiphanes, right? He compelled the Israelites, not, you know, forced them at the point of death not to eat. Not to keep the law, statutes, and commandments on all levels. Now, in process of time, when you had those sellouts, the Israelite sellouts, those Israelite sellouts, what they did was they were used as pawns by Antiochus to go from town to town and to make Jake go off. You know, they were the ones that were like the overseers, you know, used pretty much, you know, to push, you know, Antiochus Epiphanes' decree of not keeping the law. Now, when I was listening to the elder earlier, it brought to mind this conversation that the elder Apostle Tahar had with Bishop Nathaniel, to where, you know, him, Ya'asha, Rahab, you know, and the other Taza Joke and the other motley crew of demons, you know, they actually, you know, once they kicked us out because of the Cornelius issue, the Cornelius Council, which later on, now Bishop Nathaniel's teaching, you know, that Cornelius is an Israelite. When they kicked us out, one of the very first things they did was they said that the members of that congregation had to break the law in front of them, and, you know, to prove that they weren't keeping the law, and they made them to eat pork, so on and so forth. So much so that you even had 14, I believe it was, Simeonites that got up and left, you know, and never came back, or should I say, they never came back after that meeting, you know. So I'm under the impression, based off of that those individuals like Bishop Nathaniel, you know, Ya'asha, Rahab, Taza Joke, and the rest of them clowns that were down with that wicked council were those same individuals back then that were compelling Jake, you know, to eat pork. You know, remember the young men that had a reverence for Eleazar, who was an old man in his 80s, you know, and they loved him, and they didn't want to see him suffer, you know, so they said, look, we'll give you lamb, and you could act like it's pork, and you really won't be breaking the law. And he said, nah, the hell with that. I don't want people to say that when Eleazar got old, you know, pretty much he got soft, you know, and went away from the laws of his fathers, you know, something along those lines. And pretty much so much that they got angry with him, you know, they got angry with him, and the same love that they had for him and trying to get him to eat the lamb, it turned into hatred. So I believe, Bishop Nathaniel, unless he repents and turns around from that madness, Yahusha, Rahab, Taza Joke, and the rest of them clowns back then that, had a hand in kicking us out, or Mafia, that old goat, that had us kicked out of the house of David. Those are the same individuals that were compelling Jake to eat pork and to break the law and not circumcise their sons, not keep the Sabbath, so on and so forth back then. And this is history that you have to understand in order to understand the Israelite foreigner issue. Because that's the point. See, the Israelite foreigner issue is a mystery that if you don't understand that history, you won't really understand, you won't really understand the mystery of the Gentiles in the New Testament as to why, all of a sudden, in the Old Testament, the nations are just servants and slaves, but then in the New Testament, salvation is promised to them. So why is that? Why is it that in the Old Testament they're damned, so to speak, and in the New Testament they can receive salvation? Well, the reason why is because those Gentiles in the Old Testament are actual heathen, and the Gentiles in the New Testament that salvation is promised to are Israelite foreigners that became foreign throughout the different dispersions of Israel, and especially during the time of the Greek Empire. That Greco-Roman Empire did a number, on Jake, especially during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. He was pretty much instrumental in pushing, the eating pork and not keeping the law, statutes, and commandments of the Lord upon Israel. And he also used wicked Israelites, to do that. And those same individuals, keep coming back, throughout the different generations, So I believe strongly that, Bishop Nathaniel and them individuals back then were the same individuals that compelled Jake to eat, pork, because, there's a testimony where he called the pastor, which he more than likely, knowing his character, he'll deny it, he'll lie about it. It was a conversation him and Elder Pastor had on the phone, because they used to talk on the phone, and he told him straight up that pretty much, that they had a meeting, and in that meeting at the house of David, they told the members that they had to eat pork to prove that they were keeping the laws, So why would you do that, knowing that that's against the scriptures, if that wasn't a spirit that was on you in the past? Going back to the time of the Hellenization of the nation of Israel and the world too, but we're just dealing with the Israelites that were Hellenized, during the time of the Greek Empire, especially during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, Philopator the Fourth, or should I say Ptolemy the Fourth, Philopator, which was the one that branded Israel with the ivy leaf tobaccus. So there was a lot of wickedness going on back then by these heathens, by these Edomites, but they used a lot of Israelites to push their agenda. Just like today, you see in the so-called American government, you see Jake on all fronts of Esau's government, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the military, whether it's an administrative or whatever other, office that Esau allowed Jake to get into. You see them doing the same shit they were doing back then, being wicked, being demons. And these individuals like Bishop Nathaniel, because Bishop Nathaniel ended up becoming a cop. He wasn't a cop when he was in the at One West. I mean, unless he was undercover, which I highly doubt that, but you never know, So he became a cop, because he saw no other way, to make money, to pretty much, to get a pension, so on and so forth. The scriptures say, make no covenant with them. Now, they try to use scriptures like the centurion, and when they ask, what should they do, and then Yahushua said exactly no more than what is required, so on and so forth. Be satisfied with your wages. Yeah, but those are soldiers in the Roman military that were Israelites that were already that. They didn't become that after, teaching or repenting to the Lord and teaching the truth of the Lord. You ain't hear any of the Israelites that the Apostle Paul was teaching, that once they learned the truth and the mercy of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, that they turned around and became a centurion, became a cop. The individuals that were centurions, they were already that by the time they received the gospel of Yahushai. So you can't come and use that and say, well, you had centurions. Yeah, you had Israelite centurions, yes, but they were already Israelite centurions by the time they heard the gospel of Yahushai, not after. So the scriptures speak about not making any covenants with them. So like I said, it was just something I was thinking about. The elder was going into the history, and that thought just popped in my head. The phone conversation that Apostle Tahar had with Bishop Nathaniel on the phone years ago, where the Bishop Nathaniel told him that after they kicked us out, they told the congregation that they had to eat pork to prove in front of them, to prove that they weren't keeping the laws, and that caused certain individuals, 14 to be exact, Simeonites, to leave. And one of them actually had came by the camp on 34th and 7th years ago and gave the testimony that he was one of those men. So that is actually true. I mean, I don't know if that's one of the videos that went up on YouTube during the YouTube era, because we used to record back then too, or if that's just something that's in the ether, that's a witness and testimony that's sealed up in the heavens, So that actually happened, because if that wouldn't have happened, then how did the Apostle Tahar know about that? And why did the Spirit compel him to speak on that on 34th and 7th, that particular day, when that particular brother, that Simeonite brother, was there? Which shows you that was the Lord confirming that what Bishop Nathaniel told Apostle Tahar is true. So if Bishop Nathaniel was to deny it, we're witness that the man came down there and said that he was one of those men. So he can't deny it. I mean, he could deny it if he wants to, but that'll just make him a liar. And knowing him, the lack of character that he has, he would straight up lie about something like that. So like I said, it was just something that I was meditating on as I was watching the elder's video, that, why would you do that if you weren't doing that same thing going back to the Greek Empire, So, pretty much I just wanted to make a quick mention of that. Lord will, this was edifying. It says the things that have been is that which shall be, and that which is come, or that which is, I can't quote the scripture verbatim, I can't get it either, but you brothers know Ecclesiastes 1:9, the thing that have been is that which shall be, and then it goes on to say there's no remembrance of former things, from Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 9 on down. You can read that, and man's goings are of the Lord, bottom line. So why would you do that, if you weren't doing that in the past? And why so much emphasis on the law now, but back then you tell them, brothers and sisters in the congregation to break the law, and then prior to that you were saying keep the law. So does that sound like a double-minded man or what? So with that, I pray that you brothers and few sisters have been edified. To the next time I say shalom.